Kylie, welcome to the morning edition.
Thanks for having me on.
To start off, can you just take us through what is happening now on the streets of Iran? We know these protests, of course, kicked off a few weeks ago. They've been spreading across the country. So what sparked them in the first place and what sort of chaos and violence are we seeing?
So first of all, it's really hard to know what exactly is happening right now on the ground in Iran because for the past 3 days, there's been a complete communications blackout, including the internet being switched off, landlines, mobile phone lines being switched off. So very little has actually been able to filter out of Iran to international audiences. But what we do know is quite horrific. As you mentioned, these protests started more than 2 weeks ago now, and they were initially sparked by economic concerns, particularly the catastrophic fall of value of the rial. And so bazaar merchants and currency traders actually triggered this latest round of unrest. But very, very speedily, it became a call for the downfall of the regime. And so many people took to the streets that I think the regime started to take that very seriously. And as a result, we've seen this massive, brutal, violent crackdown with live fire being used against protesters, reports of thousands of dead, hundreds and hundreds of bodies piling into the morgues and the hospitals, or being cleared off the streets. And a lot of people are really, really concerned, given this blackout, that, a massacre has been committed in the darkness.
It's just horrific. And you, of course, have a unique insight into the Iranian regime and the uprisings there, because you were actually sentenced to 10 years in prison in Iran after being convicted of being a spy without evidence until you were released in 2020. This is after 804 days spent in prison, a year of that in solitary confinement. Some of the time that you spent in the Iranian prison was during the 2019 uprising. So I really want to ask you, what was your reaction when you first started seeing these uprisings again in Iran?
There are strong echoes of what happened in 2019, although I think this is on a far wider scale, and also the scale of the fatalities is probably greater as well. But both the protests in 2019 and the current protests of the end of 2025, 2026 were triggered by economic concerns. This is because the regime has run the Iranian economy into the ground. Inflation is off the scale. People can't afford to even buy basic foodstuffs, basic medicine. I think the cost of medicine is up 50% in the past 6 months alone. And this is a country that has some of the most extensive oil and gas reserves in the world and has all the potential to become, a thriving, economic powerhouse in the region. So it's really tragic what's happened. Between 30 and 40% of the country now lives below the poverty line, and that's a conservative estimate. So 2019 was triggered by removal of subsidies for benzene or petrol in Iran, and that led people to take to the streets. And similar to today, very quickly it escalated into calls for the overthrow of the regime. We also saw a mass movement in 2022 as well, of course, which was triggered by the death in custody of Mahsa Amini, a young woman who was beaten to death by the morality police for not wearing her hijab correctly. So whatever the trigger is, very, very quickly, again and again, the trend is that the people want this regime gone. And that's, the overwhelming refrain, no matter which round of protests we're talking about.
And I'm just wondering, did you have some sort of visceral reaction when you're seeing these horrific images, the ones we have been able to see coming out of Iran now, the bodies in the streets and the structures lit on fire, and of course the crackdown from the regime? Did you have some sort of visceral physical reaction? Because of course you suffered so horrifically under the regime when you were there in prison.
Yeah, every time something like this erupts in Iran, it really does take me back. A lot of the protesters that were arrested in 2019 were housed in the facility that I was being kept in at the time, the Dualef unit run by the Revolutionary Guard inside Evin prison. And, I saw many of them. I saw them being taken to interrogation. They were going throughout the night, 24 hours a day, blindfolded, handcuffed, kept in solitary confinement. It's obviously really upsetting, and I can imagine that exact stuff is happening right now, and perhaps even worse. We've had reports of horrific beatings and torture being meted out to protesters that have been arrested this time around. Reports of young girls, 10-year-old, 12-year-old young girls in their hundreds being kept in some of the women's prisons, not able to tell their families where they are or even that they're alive. And the regime's recently announced it's going to start executing protesters. Protesters that were arrested just last week have already been rushed through and sentenced to death. And there's reports that one young man, Irfan Sultani, has been scheduled for execution on Wednesday. So this is obviously a mockery of any semblance of justice. And it's really, really concerning. It shows that the regime believes it's existential now for them.
Well, I wanted to ask you that because we've seen some commentary from former CIA senior Middle East analyst William Usher. He's called this, quote, the biggest moment in Iran since 1979, which is when the Shah, the former king of Iran, was overthrown and the Ayatollahs took over and then, of course, implemented their brutal authoritarian regime. So do you agree? Do you think this is the biggest moment in Iran since 1979?
I think it has the potential to be so if the protesters succeed. There have been many such statements for previous rounds of protest, and the regime clawed it back in the end through brutal violence on the streets. So I think the regime is terminal. I think we're going to see the downfall of this regime at some point. Whether or not this is the turning point and this is the moment, I'm not sure, but I hope it is. Certainly there's a vibe shift happening here. It does feel different this time around. 2022 was extremely widespread as well. And it went on for more than 12 months. I mean, it was a really lingering, set of protests, and all over the world, reflected in the diaspora communities, people were protesting as well. But there was really a feeling of hope back then. I mean, I took part in some of the protests. I was active on the scene at the time. And there was just this hope that maybe this is the new dawn for Iran. Maybe we can instate democracy. This time around, I really feel like it's characterized by desperation and just the feeling of I've got nothing to lose. Even if I die, I've got nothing to lose anyway. People are saying, well, I'm half dead as it is. I can't even put food on the table. So I may as well go out and protest, and who cares if they shoot me? And that kind of level of desperation just, I haven't seen in the past. It shows that people are really fed up and they're willing to risk their lives to get rid of this regime.
And so you mentioned just before, this could be the overthrow. It could happen now if the protests succeed. So what will it take for the protests to succeed? Could it be related to what you're saying is this vibe shift, that it feels different now from previous protests?
I think if we look throughout history, particularly 20th century and also the Arab Spring 21st century history of protest, we really need to see a splintering in the pro-regime elites. And that includes the security forces, of which there are many in Iran, and some of them are kind of rival factions of one another, of varying ideological levels of adherence to the supreme leader. So if we saw some kind of splintering either within the political elites or the social elites that traditionally support the regime, or the security forces, for example, the military refusing to fire on protesters, or defections, prominent people, prominent commanders, for example, defecting to the side of the protesters and protecting them with their weapons, this would be what I think is needed to redress the balance of violence on the streets. The fact that the monopoly on violence is all in the regime's hands right now, and the people are defenseless. This is what it took during many of the Arab Spring uprisings that were successful, or that, unfortunately became civil wars like what we saw in Libya or Yemen or Syria. I don't think that will be the fate of Iran. The Iranian people do not want to take up arms. I think it's been an overwhelmingly peaceful revolution so far, but that there is a danger there. And, no revolution can succeed really without that splintering or without some external intervention. And I don't think either option, most people in Iran do not want the United States to militarily intervene, or Israel or any other power. What I've heard consistently said is that this is our job that we need to complete. We need to remove our own tyrannical regime ourselves. We're accepting and hopeful that we'll get support from abroad, but we don't want Trump to come in and do it for us. There'll be a lot of unintended consequences that could ensue if that was to happen. And this is an organic uprising. They're not the puppets of the US or any other power. This is a grassroots-led movement, and they want to finish the job themselves.
So what do you think would be more likely to happen, regime toppling or the regime staying in power and a transfer of power to someone else? Because we know we've been hearing comments from the former Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi. He's been making statements saying that he'd like to be a part of, the Iranian transition to democracy. I don't know how credible or how much support he has. So what do you sort of think might be the most likely?
What is the best option for Iran and what is the most likely thing to happen are sadly two very different scenarios in my view. I think the overwhelming majority of the protesters and of the people in Iran want some form of transition to democracy. Whether or not that's what they would get depends on the manner in which the regime departs. The danger in some of Trump's pronouncements, for example, is that, the Venezuela option, so removing the guy at the top, letting the rest of the regime edifice remain in place, could just see a continuation of the regime, perhaps in a slightly different ideological form. And that's not what the people want. But there has to be some accommodation, obviously, with some elements of the regime. I mean, that splintering that I mentioned earlier, but also, you do have hundreds of thousands of people that still support the regime that perhaps are ideologically wedded to its worldview. What do you do with them if you overthrow these guys somehow? If you were to wave a magic wand and they would disappear, the regime would disappear tomorrow. What are you going to do with all of the regime supporters and the more low-level members of its, officialdom or military or IRGC? You have to have some kind of accommodation, which might be politically unpalatable to the more strident factions that are opposing the regime right now. And, Reza Pahlavi, he has a sizable cohort of support in the diaspora, and they're very noisy, particularly online and in diaspora protests. He does have some support within Iran, and we've seen people chanting his name in the protests. But there are also considerable bodies of people, including political organizations. The Kurdish organizations, for example, have come out and said, we do not support Reza Pahlavi. We will not have a return to the monarchy. You need to remember that the 1979 revolution happened for a reason. And, Reza Pahlavi's father, Mohammad Reza, the Shah at the time, was not a Democrat. He was also repressive. His Savak security services were also torturing people in prison. And whilst a lot of Iranians have a sense of nostalgia for that era, Iran was certainly more prosperous back then under the Shah and was traveling in the right direction, many would claim, as opposed to now. It doesn't mean that that's the democracy that the Iranian people overwhelmingly are calling for. And, Reza Pahlavi, he says all the right things and he seems committed to democracy. He could definitely play a role in a transitional council or, a group of prominent Iranian opposition leaders that might potentially transition to holding democratic elections. But is he alone the solution to this? I don't think so. And a number of his supporters and advisors have shown very worrying far-right extremist tendencies that don't necessarily align with Reza Pahlavi's own pronouncements about democracy. So I would definitely, flag that as an area for concern. I think he does potentially have a role to play, but I don't think we're going to see him sweep back into power and reinstate the monarchy as it was in 1979.
And you mentioned United States President Donald Trump back there. You said that the majority of Iranian people do not want America coming in and trying to rescue them. They don't want to have their government be some sort of puppet power. That's the U.S. is controlling. But what is the U.S.'s role in Iran or its responsibility here?
The US does not necessarily have an explicit responsibility. I mean, there's the R2P, the responsibility to protect doctrine under international law, but, we can't really claim that the Trump administration is, a big fan of international law anyway, and I doubt that that's their motivating principle. I would, probably give a more mercantile interpretation to that. And, seeing what's just happened in Venezuela, Iran has some of the biggest oil and gas reserves in the world. And obviously it's a long-standing foe of the United States. So there would be other motivations there if Trump was to intervene beyond, a sense of responsibility for protecting innocent protesters being gunned down in the streets. That being said, a lot of people in Iran have welcomed Donald Trump's comments on Truth Social. Even when I was in prison, many of the activists and political prisoners I was imprisoned alongside would say things to me like, we hope Trump will come and bomb Iran. And this was Trump, his first term in office. There is some sentiment there that thinks that an intervention by Trump would be useful and helpful. But more broadly, Iranians are also aware that certain aspects, not only pro-regime, but, elements of Western media too, are sympathetic to the charge that they are acting at the behest of Trump or of the Americans or of Netanyahu and the Israelis. And they're very keen to assert that that's not the case, that this is an organic uprising. They've risen up many times before. They don't act at the behest of foreign powers, but this is something that they want at the grassroots level. They want to remove this regime for their own sakes. So, there's a diversity of opinion about Trump within Iran and in the diaspora. I don't necessarily think that a military intervention will be at all helpful, but they do appreciate his rhetorical support, I would say.
Which, of course, is particularly pertinent because just in the last few weeks, he's been threatening to crack down on Iran should the regime continue to kill innocent protesters, which you have flagged you certainly think is going to be building over the next few days and weeks, if anything. Do you think that threat is, do you think it's credible? Do you think that he might actually crack down in any practical way on the Iranian regime? And do you think that that's giving any Iranians hope from whatever contact you have with your friends and acquaintances in Iran?
With Trump, anything's possible, right? He's already bombed Iran once during last year's war between Iran and Israel, and he's clearly developed a taste for military interventionism, given what's happened in Venezuela, despite his pronouncements to be an isolationist. So we never know what he's going to do, but, where is he going to bomb and who is he going to bomb? This is a very different situation to dismantling the nuclear program, which is what he bombed in June of last year. These protests are happening all over the country. Units of the IRGC and the besieged militia force are putting them down violently, shooting people in the streets in all of the main cities and towns across the country. We can assume Ayatollah Khamenei is hiding out in a bunker somewhere. Who is he going to bomb and where, and what difference is that going to make? There's a sizable risk it could actually backfire. Certainly any American bombing of Iran would push all of the supporters of the regime even more firmly behind it, and maybe see more, take to the streets in support of the besieged and the IRGC. It would mobilize those forces further, within the regime, and perhaps would act as a disincentive for any defections or any, efforts to not fire on protesters or, within that grouping. So, I'm not quite sure what it could achieve. They could potentially take out the Supreme Leader, but then whoever replaces him could be even worse. The Supreme Leader is 86 years old. He's an old man. He's in ill health. Predictions of his death have, been swirling for years and years at this point. It's thought that he might be the last cleric that rules the Islamic Republic, and that an IRGC, a Revolutionary Guard cohort or strongman, might step into the breach if and when he passes away. So, is that necessarily a better outcome? I don't think so. I think better the devil you know when it comes to Khamenei. So, yeah, it's all really super fraught and really impossible to predict, but I think there are no good options for Trump at the moment, really.
And that's so interesting what you say about how a potential strike from the US could actually strengthen the IRGC as opposed to sort of breaking them down at all. And I just wanted to pick up on something you said earlier, because you said, if anything, to make this protest a success and actually have it be something that overthrows the regime, it would take a splintering among the political elites. And presumably the refusal of the IRGC to act militarily against the people. So I guess what might be different this time? Like, what would incentivize the IRGC or the political elites to splinter and to actually do what they would have to do for this to become actually something that overthrows the regime?
I think what's different this time is the level of vulnerability of the regime itself. The writing is on the wall. We know that this regime is teetering. The IRGC, the besieged, and it's all, the traditional ultra-religious voting bloc or constituency that has supported the regime, they can also see that. They can see that it wasn't able to defend itself during the 12-day war with Israel. Israel took out all of its air defenses immediately. They still don't have control over the skies, even now in Iran. They haven't reestablished that deterrence factor. The high-level assassinations of regime officials during that war also, they've been infiltrated to the highest possible levels. That was highly humiliating and embarrassing for the regime, and it sort of revealed them to be the emperor with no clothes in many ways. The emptiness of their rhetoric and their attempts to project strength was revealed. The regime's vulnerability would mean that some, perhaps at a certain tipping point, might judge that it's better to jump to the other side and be on the winning side than to stay and potentially have the regime fall and face whatever retribution might be meted out following that. This is what we've seen in previous revolutions. It's that sense that, you're fleeing a sinking ship and you want to be on the right side of history. Now, also, we've seen reticence to fire upon protesters in more isolated, incidents in previous rounds of protest. But there are reports that Khamenei, the supreme leader, is reluctant to incorporate the regular military into these operations because there are fears that a number of them won't fire on their compatriots on the streets. That's why they're only at the moment using the more hardline ideological Revolutionary Guard and besieged militia forces. So there is certainly fears that some of these conscripts, because many of them are conscripts, young men in the military, might actually refuse orders. And that's, I think, if that was to happen, that would be seismic as well.
That's so interesting. And Kylie, just to wrap up, last year you spoke at a convention in Geneva and you spoke of being ashamed of numerous Western governments, including Australia's government, at turning a blind eye to sanctions on Iran and letting the regime essentially go about its business as usual. This was in the wake of the 2022 uprisings. So I'm just wondering what message, if any, you have for the Australian government now in terms of how it should be supporting the Iranian people. And do you think that our government has, in turning a blind eye, been complicit in the continued persecution of the Iranian people by the Iranian regime?
So these remarks were a few years ago, certainly before Anthony Albanese expelled the Iranian ambassador last year and prescribed the IRGC as a terror organisation within Australia, which I was very supportive of. And, I applaud them for doing that and taking that step. I would urge the Australian government to encourage its international friends and allies to follow them down that path. So we've seen the US and Canada also prescribe the IRGC. Why doesn't the Australian government join with those two other countries to encourage the European governments and the UK to similarly ban the IRGC and list it as a terror organisation? I think that would be an obvious next step. Let's unite our allies with the same suite of sanctions, the same suite of prescriptions against some of these Iranian entities, so that they have no cracks that they can fill in order to worm their way out of our sanctions regimes. I think that's quite a logical step, and same with the ability of the IRGC in particular to sell oil on the black market. I think Trump's recently announced tariffs of 25% or something like that on anybody who buys Iranian oil, probably largely China, maybe India to an extent as well. But I don't think that's going to have any impact because most of it's sold on the black market anyway, by oil tankers potentially flagged under different countries' auspices and not, tagged as being an Iranian product. So we need to, these are being monitored. There are, organizations that monitor the flow of black oil on the black market. We need to crack down on those tankers and really stifle the regime's ability to fund its security forces, given we know it's bankrupt, given we know it's, with this internet blackout right now, it's costing the regime millions and millions each day to maintain this blackout. Can't maintain that forever. It's, it's broke. So let's stifle them and strangle them as much as possible and prevent them from, buying weapons, prevent them from paying their security forces because, the people who are being paid by the regime to fire on innocent protesters are also doing it tough. They're also struggling to make ends meet. Maybe that's why they've taken this job in the first place. Let's crack down on that financing and show the Iranian people that we support them. Australia is not a major player here by any means, but I do think it was quite symbolic that we prescribed the IRGC and kicked out the Iranian ambassador. So I think we can build on that momentum and that leadership by taking further steps and encouraging our allies to join us.
Well, thank you so much, Kylie, for your time.
Thanks so much for having the chat.